to talk about one thing and one thing only, and that is the cerebrum. So we're going to get into the major regions that we find in the adult brain. We'll talk about some of the specific anatomical structures of the cerebrum, talk about certain tracts that are associated with the white matter. Remember, tracts? Oh man, we've seen that before, nerves and tracts, with the cerebrum and their functions, and then talk about the cerebral nuclei and some of the functional areas of the cerebral cortex and where we find those. So we have four major regions of the brain: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. We're only going to focus on the cerebrum for this video. We'll have a whole nother video that gets into the rest of that. But when we look at the cerebrum, if you think of it, right, the cerebrum is the part of the brain you're thinking of when you're thinking of a brain, right? So you think about like a brain and all the wrinkles and folds and all that. That is the cerebrum, right? That bulk of the brain is the cerebrum, and it's the thing you kind of focus on, and that makes you think brain, right? But those ridges, those valleys and folds and all that have names. The ridges, so the raised parts, are called gyri or gyrus if we're talking singular, and the grooves, so the little divots inward, are called sulci or sulcus if we're talking about one. And we can use these as landmarks. There's specific ones that we can use that help us separate out different regions in the cerebrum. And so there's a few main sulci in this case. We have the central sulcus, the lateral sulcus, the parieto-occipital sulcus, which if you think about those, at least one of those, we have some information that can tell us where we find it, right? Parieto-occipital, we've gone over bones, so those two terms should sound familiar. Lateral and central kind of give us a bit of an idea just based on location. If we go right before the central sulcus, anterior to that, we have the pre-central gyrus, and then just behind it, just posterior to that, we have the post-central gyrus. And there's an interesting link between these two gyri at the central sulcus. When we are dividing the left and the right side of the brain, so what we call the cerebral hemispheres, that would just be the left and the right sides, we have what's called the longitudinal fissure. This is that long, deep dive in. It's that long, deep dive in that separates left and right, and we connect the two hemispheres together with the corpus callosum. When we look at the cerebrum, we can break it down into the cerebral cortex, which is the gray matter. Remember that gray matter is like the outer layer. It's relatively thin compared to everything else. The basal nuclei, which are the deeper regions where we have these neurons hanging out, and then the tracts, which is going to have that white matter. So this is that pre and post central gyri that I was talking about, the central sulcus. So the central sulcus, if we think of it, kind of in a way divides the front from the back of the cerebrum. The lateral sulcus we see running along the side, right, kind of dividing the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobe, and then the parieto-occipital sulcus back here is dividing up the parietal and the occipital lobes, right? But all this wrinkled bit, right, this is all the cerebrum. We're not, at least in this video, we're not worried about all this stuff that's going on down here. We have a whole nother video where we'll talk about that. So for right now, we're not even going to look at that. We are just worried about this big wrinkly bit up here. Here's that longitudinal fissure. So here we're looking from the top down, right? So we're taking on a superior view. Here's the anterior end, here's the posterior end, and that longitudinal fissure runs the entire length of that cerebrum, dividing the left from the right hemisphere. And we can't see it here, but there is a corpus callosum deeper in there that is joining the two hemispheres together. Right, again, remember the gyri are all of the areas that are raised, the sulci are the areas that are diving in, that fold in. So if we take a coronal section of the brain, we've basically like cut away the front half of the brain, so we're looking at the inside of the back half. Here's that corpus callosum that's joining the two hemispheres together. And then we see that cortex in the gray matter and the tracts running in the white matter. Right, that's something we could not see before. Here's that basal nuclei. It's kind of deeper in right here. And we see that we've changed color, which means we've changed the type of matter. All right, now I mentioned it just previously in this video, but we're going to talk about it again because I didn't really talk about what it is. But we have different lobes. I mentioned it when we were talking about the different sulci, or different the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus and all that, right? But we didn't actually really address them. But we have 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex, and the names should sound familiar, right? The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. We also have the insula, which is going to help with taste, but I'm most worried about these first 4. So the frontal lobe, just based on the name, they're all named after the bones, the cranial bones they're hiding under. So the frontal lobe is going to be just behind the frontal bone, which we know is in the anterior side, right? It's in the front. The frontal lobe is where your conscious thought kind of sits. It's where your motor function is being controlled, and your decision making. So your conscious thought that you're having right now is coming from that frontal lobe. All the motions you're making, maybe you're writing something down while you're listening to this, that's coming from your frontal lobe. The parietal lobe, which is just behind that, is where we get somatosensation processing. Now, somatosensation, we've seen this, not this exact word before, but we've seen the roots before, somato and sensory, right? So somato, we think body, we think muscle, right? Remember those somites from the muscles? Ooh, man, we're linking things together. But the somatosensation is the sensory information of things like skin and muscles. So parietal lobe will handle that, so your sense of touch. The temporal lobe is going to help process your hearing, your sense of smell, as well as memories. And then the occipital lobe is really just worried about visual, processing all the visual information you bring in. And then I mentioned the insula, which is deep to the lateral sulcus, so we're going deep in, that's where we process taste. So here we see the frontal lobe. Again, that's going to be handling things like motor control, motor output, right? Conscious thought, right? Higher thinking. We have the parietal lobe here, which is going to handle somatosensory information. We have the occipital lobe back here in green, that's handling visual, and then the temporal lobe, which is going to handle hearing and smell, things like that, right? And then taste would be like further down here, deeper than what we see in this picture. Now remember those basal nuclei, remember we noted they were a different color from the white matter that was surrounding them. That's because they are made of gray matter. So this is, when we think of the cerebral cortex, right, that outer layer of gray, then everything was like white underneath it, there are some areas where gray matter gets really deep in the brain, and those we call basal nuclei. We have the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus. These are deep basal nuclei in the cerebrum, and they're going to help control movement, right? So the striatum is going to be the caudate and the putamen together. We also have basal nuclei in other locations in the brain, including the subthalamic nucleus in the diencephalon, the substantia nigra in the midbrain of the brainstem, and the limbic system. Some of these, like the limbic system, we're going to get into a different video, so we're not going to hit it too hard here. But we can at least see where they're at, right? So remember, the ventricles are deep in here. Here's the corpus callosum that links the left and the right together. Here's that globus pallidus. Here's that caudate and the putamen that form the striatum, right? Here's the insula, again, which is going to be where things like taste are done. And here's the amygdala, right here, which will be part of that limbic system. Now we mentioned the white matter tracts. Remember, tracts and nerves, same thing, just different names for different locations. It's a white matter because it's made of myelinated axons. Remember, myelin has a heavy lipid content, which is why it appears white. But these are going to connect the different regions of the cerebral cortex so that we're not just sending information to one area and then the brain's not communicating with the rest of the areas, right? We want to integrate information together so we can generate a motor response that makes sense, right? That's going to actively be a good response to whatever the sensory information was. And so we can have three different types, three different groups of these tracts. The commissural tracts, right? This is going to extend between the two hemispheres, so we're connecting left and right. So the corpus callosum is an example of that. We have association tracts, right? These are going to connect the gyri of the different lobes in the same hemisphere. And then projection tracts, this is where we're extending from the cerebral cortex to other regions of the brain or to the spinal cord. So things like commissural tracts, we're going to connect left and right cerebral hemispheres. Association tracts we see on the same hemisphere of the cerebrum, just different lobes. And then projection tracts, this is connecting the cerebrum to like the cerebellum or to the spinal cord, to the midbrain, right? To some other part of the brain that's not the cerebrum. So here we see some of those. We see the different tracts and the different types, like the arcuate and the longitudinal fasciculi, which are those association tracts. So we see the arcuate fibers running like this. Here's our longitudinal ones running the length of the brain, basically. Commissural, right, is going to connect to left and right, so it makes sense that they're going like kind of perpendicular. And then projection tracts are going to be connecting that side to other parts, like in this case, we're coming down into the brainstem. So let's talk about some of these association areas. There's different areas. So a little bit of history. In the early 1900s, this neuroscientist named Brodmann, he divided the cerebral cortex into 52 separate regions on the basis of histology. Right, so looking at the cells and everything, he's like, I'm going to divide it up based on what I see in there on a microscopic level. And all these regions are called Brodmann's areas. We have continued to study this, and we know now there's a strong correlation between these areas and the functions attributed to these regions. So like, it holds water, right? This concept of these areas holds water. We have primary areas and we have association areas, so two different areas that we can see. Primary areas is where sensory information is initially received for like perception, right? So like we're bringing in this information, like visual information to the occipital lobe, right? We're bringing that information in. And then, you know, the commands that get sent down the brainstem, spinal cord to execute the movements that we need to do are coming from these primary areas as well. And then around these primary areas, we have these association areas. Right? And so again, all these areas are working together to create this complex picture, and the complex actions. So we're not going to go through all 52 because that's horrible. In this class, but we do want to at least talk about a couple of them that are prime, right? So you don't even memorize 52 of these things, but you do want to know about a couple of these key ones, like the primary motor cortex right here. This is going to be one of those primary areas. This is going to basically be the area where we really are controlling movement, so your ability to walk, talk, things like that, like to execute the individual actions that are required for you to move are coming from that area. And then right next door, we have the primary somatosensory cortex. The cool thing here is, right dividing the primary motor cortex from the primary somatosensory cortex, this line right here, that is the central sulcus. So in this green, this like true green, is the frontal lobe, and in this more like blue teal color is the parietal lobe. And the cool thing is the areas in the primary motor cortex and primary somatosensory cortex that line up, or that control different body parts, they line up together. So if we're controlling, let's say, the lips here, right? Let's say like right here is like where we control like lips. Then right next door across the way is going to be things like the sensation of touch on those lips, right? The feeling of that, the ability to feel something, right? Something hot, cold, something pushing on it, right? That they're right across the way from each other. So we see that correlation between like the motor control of each body part, like the arm, leg, whatever, and the somatosensory area for that is literally right next door. We also have the primary visual cortex back here in the occipital lobe, so that's going to help handle visual information. The primary auditory cortex are here in orange, and then these are two interesting areas here. We have the Wernicke's area, which is 39 and 40, and then also the Broca's area, which is 44 and 45. These two are going to handle the understanding and interpretation of speech, as well as your ability to formulate your own speech and be able to actually speak, right? So to be able to pull the words, what words do I want to use, as well as how do I actually make the movements to speak, right? How do I move my mouth to make these certain sounds? So a lot of stuff here. We're going to try to sum it up in a little bit. But the frontal lobe, again, controlling motor functions, right? That right before that central sulcus and the precentral gyrus, that's where we have the primary motor cortex. Again, this is telling the spinal cord to move skeletal muscles. So your ability to wiggle your fingers, to bend over to touch your toes, right? That's all coming from the primary motor cortex. And then anterior to that is the motor association area, the premotor cortex. This is also going to help in the function of that, so helping you move. Just before that, we have the frontal eye field. This is going to control your eye movements that require both eyes, so your ability to coordinate your eyes together. And there's a motor homunculus that shows the representation map of the regions controlled in this lobe. So this is a lot. The things that I guess I worry about the most here is knowing where and what the primary motor cortex is, what it does, and that the premotor cortex is going to help with this. It's going to be an association area that helps the primary motor cortex, and then the frontal eye field is going to control just the eyes. So like when you need to blink your eyes together, or you're trying to focus on something and both eyes need to be looking at the same object, right? They need to coordinate. Then the frontal eye field is your deal. In the parietal lobe, right, we're just posterior to that central sulcus, right? This is where we get somatosensation, again, touch, pressure, something tickled, does it hurt, does it itch, do you feel like any sort of vibration, proprioception and kinesthesia, so movement and balance, right? Those things are all coming into play with the parietal lobe. In the primary somatosensory cortex, which again is just behind that central sulcus. The sensory association area is just posterior to that, and it's going to help process that information as well. And then a sensory homunculus, again, shows that map of the regions of the body. And we'll take a peek at the motor and the sensory homunculus in just a little bit, just to kind of see what body parts will be controlled where. So the motor and sensory homunculi are not like actual parts of the brain. It's just a depiction of what body parts are controlled by which sections of these corti. In the occipital lobe, again, visual information. We have the primary visual cortex that receives and processes that information. And then we do have visual association areas that are going to help with that visual processing. In the temporal lobe, we have the primary auditory cortex. We do have an auditory association area as well. And then the primary olfactory cortex, which processes smell. So anything auditory deals with noise, sound, things like that. And then primary olfactory cortex will process anything with scent. And then the insula, if you remember that slightly deeper in area, that's where we get the primary gustatory cortex, and this is going to handle taste. So here's just those areas. So here in this, if we look in the green areas, we're looking at frontal lobe, and so we see in the deepest green is the primary motor cortex. The motor association areas, that's going to help out, and then the frontal eye field here. And then we have the Broca's area right here. On the parietal end, we have the sensory, the primary somatosensory cortex in this deeper kind of hot pink, and then the sensory association area is back here. The Wernicke's area is right here encircled. And then the primary visual cortex back here in deep pink with its primary association area. And then if we look at the temporal lobe, we see the primary auditory cortex and the auditory association area in purple. And then this area that has the dotted line is considered the general interpretation area, where we can kind of pull some stuff together. This is that homunculus I was talking about. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned that, like, if this part of this of the somatosensory area is getting information from, like, the lips, then just across the way we're going to have the motor control for the lips, right? And so if we trace it, right, we kind of have like this person, right? It kind of follows in order, right? So we go from like the genitals, the toes, the feet, the leg, the hip, so like the lower extremity. Then we get into the trunk, right? So the trunk, your torso, your neck, your head, shoulder. Then your arm, right? So your arm going from your elbow down to your wrist to your hand down to your fingers. And then we get to the face, where we get your eyes, nose, lips, teeth, gums, and jaw, tongue, and pharynx. And if you, again, like, it's not perfectly lined up with the way our bodies are, but it's pretty dang close. I mean, you think about how it's organized. It's, for the most part, organized from bottom to top. And that's amazing, right? That's absolutely amazing that we have that set up. So this is for the sensory information. So, you know, whether or not you feel something on your skin, like if something burns your tongue, right? Or if something pokes your thumb, or someone comes and taps your shoulder, right? This is the area that is processing and telling you, hey, you were touched here. It was someone just poked you lightly. It's just a tap versus someone like hit you, right? And we would see the same setup, like I mentioned, the same setup for the motor control. It would be the same exact setup just across the central sulcus. All right, getting to some other areas, these are functional areas, so integrative, memory and learning, and language and speech. So integrative areas, these are found between other areas and help process information in more complex ways, so where we can integrate information together, maybe from more than one area. Memory and learning, these are mainly part of the temporal lobe, as well as some deeper structures like the hippocampus and the amygdala, which are, at least in part of your limbic system. And then language and speech, this is coming from the left hemisphere in the two different regions. We have the Wernicke's area. This is your area that's going to help you understand a language. So whether, you know, understanding something you hear, understanding something you write, you read, right? Because you can process, I mean, think about it, you can hear someone and you hear the noise, but this isn't about hearing the noise, it's about making sense of it. So if I hear someone say, hey, it's been such a long time since I've seen you, I don't just hear the sounds, I understand, oh, someone that I probably know from a long time ago who I haven't seen in a while is calling to me, right? It's trying to start a conversation with me. So I'm making sense of it. The Broca's area, this is responsible for the production of language and like controlling the movements for speech. So this would be like, if I wanted to respond, can I pull the right words that make sense for the response I want to give? Can I actually move my mouth and my tongue, right? Can I move all my body parts that are required in the way that I need to formulate those words? So the Wernicke's and Broca's area both handle language, but in different ways. Wernicke's focuses on the understanding of language. Broca's area is for producing that language. And it's interesting because with both of them, we're talking about both written and verbal, right? So we're talking about being able to understand and respond both in writing and being able to talk. It's really interesting if you see videos of aphasia. I'll probably show those at some point in class. When someone has had a stroke that has affected these areas, it's very interesting to see how it affects that person's speech, because it affects their speech in very different ways. So here's the Wernicke's area a little bit further back, and then the Broca's area up here. So we have the Wernicke's like in the temporal, and then Broca's is going to be up in the frontal lobe.